Welcome back. You have just tuned in to Women's AM. This morning, I'm joined by Sister Ayan and Sister Razia Adnan. Assalamu alaikum, sisters. Welcome back. And Jazakallah khair for joining us this morning, Sister. And you bring so much, knowledge and experience for the topic that we're talking about today. Obviously, you have 4 children, mashallah, and you have 2 boys. And I understand that you're working in the charity sector as well, organising events on top of that. So I just don't know how you're able to sort of manage your time.
I have no idea either. I try my best. What I do is I organise events for the Convivencia Trust. It's a charity, and they organise educational events for the youth, for academics. You know, they sponsor students to higher education, so mashallah, they do all sorts of things. And what I've introduced to Convivencia are the ladies' events and motivational ones.
Mashallah, I think it's these events for the youth, I think, is such a fantastic thing. If we can engage the youth and kind of get them on the right path, essentially, then that is such an important task. So, mashallah, I really admire your being able to do all that, mashallah, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the discussion. Without further ado, let's now go straight to her views, where today we are discussing raising sons. Raising children in Islam is considered a trust, and with that trust bears a great responsibility. We often hear about the importance of raising the next generation, but sometimes raising sons, especially in the society we live in, and the influences around us, may not always be an easy task. With the many challenges facing children and parents alike, how does one raise their sons successfully? And what guidance does Islam give us on this issue? Of course, this is a live discussion, so please do call in with your comments or questions. The number to call is on your screens now, or you can tweet us at Islam Channel, #WAM15. So, Sister Razia, I'm going to come to you first. As I said, such a great discussion, and I know many sisters, they're raising sons, some of them single parents, and it can be, a very difficult task. So what are the differences in raising sons as opposed to raising daughters?
Well, I have 2 daughters, and I found girls, they were a lot more emotional, they were a lot more emotional.
More emotional, yeah.
Whereas I think the boys have always been very quiet, very laid back, and sometimes I always found myself a bit lost as to what he's thinking, what's going on inside his mind. But I think there's definitely a difference. There's definitely an emotional difference, and it's something that can sometimes get very confusing for mothers out there. And it's something that we have to deal with, I think, with a lot of patience, a lot of sabr, and a lot of wisdom.
No, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And obviously, Ayan, you've got a son that you're raising at the moment as well. So, what would you say you kind of come across the kind of major difficulties?
I think I don't know if it's just to do with the son I have. I can't compare to raising a girl, but they're just so stubborn sometimes.
Really?
Subhanallah. I mean, but I think with girls, they're more. How to say, they're more diplomatic. Girls find ways of being more diplomatic than boys. I find boys are very, very direct. They don't know how to kind of say things in a nicer way or do things in a nicer way. Everything's very, very direct, and I think it's just maybe part of their nature. They like to get things done. They don't like to kind of try and make things a little bit more flowery, whereas maybe girls do. I'm trying to compare that to my younger cousins. But subhanallah, it's quite funny in the way the mind works when it comes to young boys. The things that they think about, the things that they say, sometimes it's really weird.
And Sister Razia, obviously you've got a 20-year-old son and a 7-year-old son, so you've got sort of quite a sort of grown-up son and a younger son, so you've obviously seen all the different stages they go through.
For sure. I think a lot of it is to do, though, with patience, like I said before, and befriending your children in general as well. Not just the boys, but the girls. But I think
this is something Islamically that's recommended, isn't it?
I found my girls to be naturally much more friendlier.
Oh, really?
Whereas the boys, like you're saying, they can be very distant and very blunt. And sometimes I found myself really trying to befriend even my 19-year-old. But we've always had this best friend relationship, mashallah, because of that friendship I've tried to keep. And so even when he would make a mistake, do something wrong, I would never shout and tell him off, I would always use a gentle approach to things, you know, where I would make him recognise, you know, his mistake without being angry.
It's lovely to have that relationship, I think, with, you know, with any of your children. But I think we do see sometimes with parents there is this kind of disparity in the way that you're raising daughters and the way that we're raising sons. Why do you think this is, Ayan?
I think it comes down to culture. I think you find cultures where, and I've seen this, where you put a lot of responsibility on the daughters and not as much responsibility on the sons. So you find that girls are always pushed to be more domestic, and that they have to clean up after their brothers, and you know, they don't actually have to do that. Why should they have to do that? The boys are supposed to be responsible for themselves as much as the girls are, and why is it that girls should always take the responsibility for them? They shouldn't have to, and they don't have to. And also you get sort of, you know, these ideas that somehow the honour of the family rests solely with the daughter as well, and that isn't the case. If you want your children to be a certain way, then you need to make sure that you're pushing these ideals on both your children. So if you want them to be dignified, if you want them to be honourable, if you want them to have, you know, that self-respect and self-esteem, you need to push that for both your sons and your daughters. It's not just a one-way thing. And I think there's just so much placed on girls than boys, and it creates a lot of pressure and a lot of resentments, and that's why you get a lot of girls who rebel a lot, because they think, well, how come he gets to do whatever he wants? How come he gets to go wherever he wants? You know, and I don't get to do anything, or I don't get to go anywhere. Why do I always have to have a different set of rules? And there isn't a different set of rules when it comes to them both. So I think it's being clear on certain aspects of culture that are not inclined with our teachings in Islam, and that go against it, and in the long run have a detrimental effect on how our kids will grow up and how they will view the deen and how they view themselves as well.
No, absolutely true. And Razia, with your experience, have you noticed that you've done things maybe differently with your sons and your daughters?
Well, to be honest with you, I've done my utmost best to be as equal as I can. So there's times when I'm saying to my son, you know, could you get up and do the Hoover, and could you get up and tidy the kitchen? So I've always tried to be as just as I possibly can. And when I'm not, my 15-year-old will scream out, "Mummy, it's his turn." So, you know.
So keeping you in line.
So,
and do you think maybe that the society impacts the way that we raise our boys?
For sure it does. I think that there's a lot of impact on society in different ways on the way we raise our boys. It's a lot to do with
I think the concept of, you know, you're free to do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want. I think that has a detrimental effect, especially if you're trying to raise your children with certain values and certain morals, where you have a society that contradicts those values, and that tells us that, you know, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want that makes you happy. You are free. And I think people take this the wrong way. They think that, I'm free, and then they veer off into these directions that are just so detrimental to them. Not even just in terms of their deen, in terms of, you know, their God consciousness, but even when it comes to how they behave and interact in society and the way they choose to live their lives. You find that they don't really, they're not considerate of others. They're not considerate of others. There's no remorse sometimes to certain things that they do. There's no regret. There's all sorts of these really selfish behaviours, because they think, well, I am free to do what I want. I have to make myself happy. And I think you get that idea, that individuality pushed a lot in the society and that we live in today.
And I think this you know, concept of you know, individualism and, you know, individual gratification, it's quite a dangerous thing, as you know, as you've mentioned. So that's a really interesting point that you've picked up on there. Thank you for sharing that. And we have really had a great discussion on this so far, but we are coming up for our next break. Stay where you are. We'll return to this very shortly, where we get some tips from the Sunnah and tips from our panellists. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Women's AM. This morning I'm joined by Sister Ayan and Sister Razia Adnan. We're going to be discussing raising boys. Don't forget, if you have something to share with us on this topic, please do call in. The number is on your screens, or you can tweet us at Islam Channel, #WAM15. So we had a really interesting discussion before the break about some of the differences between raising sons and daughters. But Sister Razia, what I wanted to talk a little bit about now is some of the challenges for those raising boys in the current climate that we live in.
I think it's a very busy busy life. You know, it affects the routine, it affects discipline for boys. I think lots of mothers find themselves really stressed out because their boys aren't praying on time, or they're not, you know, fasting the way they should be. So there's a lot of confusion happening. There's a lot of temptation out there. And I think it just comes back to the discipline in the home and finding time to sit your kids down and talk to them about where their priorities lie to an extent.
I always think as well for myself, you know, my husband works a lot. Very often I'm at home alone, and obviously with my daughter, you know, it's fine because, you know, I'm sort of hoping to be the role model for her. But I always thought if I had a son, I think I might find that a little bit difficult with my husband not being there so much and not having that kind of role model around to kind of see this, you know, praying on time and, you know, the various things that obviously you want to instill in our sons. What kind of advice would you, Ayan, give to somebody in that situation?
I'm actually in that situation in the sense that I'm raising my son, and you find that it can be difficult, but you have to kind of employ what you have. So whatever tools to hand that you've got, you use that. So for example, I've got my granddad who's around, and I've got my uncles who are around, and I use them. So, you know, if they're going to the masjid, you know, I always say, oh, take Yusuf with you, you know, and he goes with them to the masjid, and he knows what he's supposed to do and where he's supposed to go and who he's supposed to be with. So it's about using what you've got and knowing what you've got and trying to kind of be as realistic as possible. So, and alhamdulillah, also having that friendship with your kids as well makes it so much easier. I find that because we talk a lot, it makes it so much easier to impart, you know, the deen towards him as well. So, you know, we talk about all sorts of things. He'll see something and then he'll say, oh, Mum, why is that? Why do people do that? And things like this. So I think it's really important to be able to have the relationship where you can have conversations with one another, and that your child feels comfortable in asking you things that maybe they wouldn't normally want to ask anyone. But I think one of the biggest challenges living as Muslims living today is that there's a lot of negativity towards Muslim, especially where the media is concerned. So it's not easy, but I think you have to kind of remind yourself and your child, constantly remind them, like, look, that's what they may say, but we know who we are. We know what Islam is. This isn't it. But also even just kind of being wary of sort of the dangers out there, because sometimes some parents not very streetwise, so they don't understand the sort of dangers that lies with letting their kids, you know, be out at certain hours, or, you know, being out all the time and not having, you know, that supervision, and not knowing who their friends are. You know, you find
it's difficult to know where to set the boundaries, isn't it? Because you want to give them that independence, but by the same token, you know, you also want to be there to kind of guide them through it a little bit, don't you? So that can be quite difficult to gauge.
I think it's just finding the time as well. Finding that time, you know, to prioritise and give them that time to talk about their problems. You know.
And I think this talking is such an important thing, isn't it? Being able to talk with your children and communicate with them. I know last week on the show, Sister Sima was saying about how she sits around the dinner table and they have these amazing discussions, and she's got 3 sons. And I think how amazing. And, you know, we have got so much to tell, you know, sons and daughters. But I think particularly when raising sons, you know, if we look back at the Prophet, peace be upon him, you know, we look to the Quran, the Sunnah, we can see, you know, so many stories and so much about the rewards. Ayan, can you enlighten us a little bit more about this?
One sort of particular story that springs to mind when I think about, like, the interaction of parents with their children and how that has an effect on them is the Prophet Yaqub's story, where we know that because of the fact that the Prophet Yaqub favoured Yusuf, his brothers, especially his older brothers, were very, very jealous, and they threw him in the well with the intention that he would just, you know, kind of disappear and never come back and possibly even die. And that all came down to the fact that they felt that their father favoured him. And we have a hadith from Sunan Abu Dawood where the Prophet ﷺ says, act equally between your children. And this is really, really important, because you are going to kind of foster certain feelings that your kids have towards you and towards one another if they feel that they're, you know, you're not treating them fairly unfairly, or that they feel that you love one child more than another, or that you are more negative towards them than than the other kids. So you have to treat them equally. But also, there's one piece of advice that's really, really beautiful. You find it in the Quran, chapter 31, verse 13, and Allah speaks about the advice that Prophet Luqman said to his son, and he said, "Oh my son, join not in worship of others with God. Verily, joining others in worship with God is a great wrong indeed." So again, it's telling us the importance of teaching Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, to our kids. So it's reinforcing what's really, really important. But also to think about the legacy that we leave behind, because although we know that children are a test for us, and that they may not always end up going in the direction that we want them to, because they are a test, but to remember that if we know that we've raised them right, we've given them the right foundation, that they may be the legacy that we leave behind. So they may be doing work in our name that will be pleasing to Allah. Exactly. So
that's really true. And I think that's you've really highlighted some kind of beautiful examples from Islam that will give us guidance on this. But I think what's interesting nowadays is this the kind of modern idea, or the modern concept of masculinity, and how do we go about teaching this to our sons, and how do we teach them about their responsibilities, etc. And obviously this is something that you've encountered with both your older and now going on with your younger son. So what
I think it's by giving them responsibilities and seeing how they handle them. I think with my son, I have had to be so patient with him at times, by giving him tasks, even the older one, as well as the younger one, and training them. I mean, when my eldest was 11, his school was so far to travel to, and I put him on a train, and I thought to myself, if I'm going to let him learn, I'm going to let him go. And so I would always recite the Ayatul Kursi, blow it, and just let him go. And the family would say to me, "You're crazy. You're letting him go so young on a train." And I said, "This is how he's going to learn."
It's true.
And mashallah, now he's grown up to be such a strong man, and it's because of all the experiences. I sent him away on a convoy with my husband by road to Gaza, and he was just 14. And I said, I had tears in my eyes as I cleaned the ambulance for them, and I said to him, I said to my husband, "I'm going to let him go because I want him to see the world. I want him to have the experience that other kids don't have."
Absolutely. And what a life-changing and life-moulding experience that must have been for him.
It comes with sacrifice.
Yeah, of course.
It comes with sacrifice.
Yeah, and I think the other key word you mentioned there is patience. I think as parents, sons or daughters, we always have to exercise a huge amount of patience. But I think, Ayaan, I just wanted to kind of delve a bit deeper into this idea of the modern idea of masculinity, and what exactly, how would you exactly describe this idea of the modern idea of masculinity, and how does that differ from Islam's perception?
I think it's a good question. I think these days, to be sort of masculine, you have to be comfortable in yourself and knowing who you are and earning a certain amount of money and looking a certain way, and somehow all of this equates to you being a successful man and all of these things. And Islam teaches us that success comes through pleasing Allah. So whatever pleases Allah, that is success. You attaining Jannah, that is success. And the ways that you go about that is inclined with what Allah and the Prophet ﷺ teach us, that is success.
So it's about realigning these ideas, isn't it? And Sister Wazir, can you give us a very quick take-home message?
Yeah, I would say be patient with your children, contemplate when you were back at their age, how you felt, and it will give you a lot of patience, and it will make you understand further, accept, them as an individual for what they are. Stop being emotional and accept what you have in front of you and try to work on that.
Absolutely. I think that's the way you can get the best out of them and the best out of your relationship with them as well. So fantastic tip. Thank you very much for that. Raising young, impressionable boys into mature, prudent and successful men is not always easy, but there is immense reward in doing this. When raising children, we are raising the next generation of the future. Ali radiallahu anh once said, "Do not raise your children the way your parents raised you. They were born for a different time." I pray we have given you some beneficial tips for raising your sons, inshallah. And don't forget, if you have missed any of today's show, all is not lost, as you can catch the highlights from all of this week on Sunday at 3 p.m. We're off now for another break, but just before we go, here is today's ayah from Surah Mulk.